You never expect a war to start over something as simple as a morning ride. But that's exactly what happened. 1 minute, I was peacefully riding my horse, Shadow, down the same public road I'd used for years. The next, I had the HOA calling the cops on me. Not because I broke a law, not because I did anything wrong, but because one power-hungry HOA president decided he didn't like me or my horse. At first, I thought it was just another petty complaint, but then came the violation notices, the fines, the lawsuit, and finally, the moment they tried to take everything from me. But what the HOA didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that I had one very important ace up my sleeve. My son, the mayor, and when they found out, it was already too late. Every morning before the world woke up, I saddled up my horse, Shadow, a retired police horse I had taken in after my wife passed. It was my therapy, my way to clear my head and hold on to the memories of her. Shadow was well-trained, calm, and smarter than most people I'd met. Our neighborhood had always been quiet. Big houses, well-kept lawns, and an HOA that liked to pretend they were running a small dictatorship instead of suburban cul-de-sac. I had been riding these roads for years without a single problem. That was until Carlton Reeves, a man who wore his HOA title like it was a royal crown, decided my horse was a threat to property values. That morning, as I trotted down the street, Carlton came storming out of his McMansion, his robe flapping like a judge ready to pass a sentence. Hey, you, stop right there. I barely pulled on Shadow's reins before Carlton was in my face, breathing hard like he had just sprinted a mile to catch me. That animal doesn't belong here, he spat, pointing at Shadow like he was a stray mutt. I glanced down the pristine, city-maintained asphalt, not a single hoofprint out of place. I sighed, keeping my voice steady. Carlton, this is a public road. I have every right to be here. His face turned an impressive shade of red. Not anymore. The HOA will be handling this. I gave him a polite nod and rode off. I'd dealt with his type before, people who thought a little bit of control over others made them important. I figured he'd cool off. I figured wrong. The next day, I woke up to a letter taped to my door, thick, heavy paper, red ink screaming violation notice. Dear Mr. Jameson, it has come to the attention of the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association that your continued horseback riding constitutes a safety risk and an undue burden on neighborhood maintenance funds. A fine of $1,000. A 48-hour deadline to remove Shadow. And the best part? A threat of $200 in additional daily fines. I read it twice, then a third time. Carlton wasn't playing games. He was testing me, seeing if I'd roll over and give in like so many others before me. Well, that wasn't going to happen. I drove straight to the city records office, where I found exactly what I expected. These roads weren't HOA property. They were maintained by taxpayer dollars. And that meant Carlton had no power here. When I got back home, my neighbors were already whispering. Some gave me sympathetic nods, while others, HOA loyalists, stood watching from their porches, arms crossed like they had been waiting for the show to start. I took the violation letter, marched right up to Carlton's door, and knocked. When he answered, I held up the letter and simply said, "Try again." His eyes narrowed. His lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "We will." That night, I got a call from Ms. Delaney, a longtime neighbor who had lived in Willow Ridge since before the HOA even existed. "Jameson, you should know they held a private vote last night. They're banning horses from the neighborhood." I rubbed my temples. On what grounds? They said it's about safety and property values. But let's be real. Carlton's wife just hates the smell of hay. I sighed. Of course. Carlton had manipulated the board, pushing through an illegal, unenforceable rule behind closed doors. And now, I was a test case, the first victim of his power trip. Well, if they wanted to fight, they had won. The next morning, another letter appeared, this time certified mail. I peeled it open and found a $1,000 fine, a formal notice of non-compliance, a threat of legal action. Oh, and the kicker? A line that read, Failure to comply will result in legal action, including but not limited to property liens and potential foreclosure. They were threatening to take my home over a horse. I clenched my jaw, but I didn't panic. Instead, I grabbed my folder of city records and started making calls. Word spread fast. Some neighbors, mostly the older folks who had been here for decades, stood behind me. This is ridiculous. We used to have riding trails through here. They muttered at the mailboxes. Others, the ones who wanted HOA favor, they avoided me. The neighborhood Facebook group became a battlefield. Horses are dangerous, someone posted. We pay too much in HOA fees for this nonsense. Another chimed in. Jameson is just trying to stir up trouble. But then there were those on my side. Since when does the HOA control public roads? Carlton is just making up rules to feel important. Jameson's been riding that horse for years. Why is this a problem now? And then the final blow came. A rumor started spreading, one that made my stomach drop. Carlton wasn't just trying to get me out. He was trying to change city law, lobbying local officials to ban horseback riding in residential areas entirely. I sat back, exhaled, and did the only thing I could think of. I called the one person who could put an end to this nonsense for good. My son, Jack, the mayor of Willow Ridge. And that's when things really got interesting. That afternoon, as I walked shadow back to the stable behind my house, I noticed someone watching me from the sidewalk. Ms. Delaney. She was a retired real estate agent, pushing 80 but still sharp as a knife. She had lived in Willow Ridge before the HOA even existed, before people like Carlton turned a peaceful neighborhood into their personal fiefdom. She waved me over. Her eyes, clear and calculating, flicked toward Carlton's house. The blinds shifted. Someone was watching. Be careful, Jameson, she said in a low voice. With what? I asked, playing dumb. With Carlton. This isn't just about your horse. It never was. He's been trying to push certain people out for years. My stomach tightened. Why? Because the more people he drives out, the more properties he snatches up at a loss. And guess what? He flips them and sells them for double. I frowned. That was interesting. So my horse isn't the real problem. No, she said, voice hard as stone. You are. I glanced back at Carlton's house, then at the violation notice still crumpled in my fist. Well, that changed things. The next morning, I drove straight to City Hall. I walked past the front desk, right up to Carol, the woman who handled public zoning records. Morning, Carol. I need to see if there's been any new ordinances proposed about horseback riding. She frowned. You're not going to like this, Jameson. My gut clenched. She pulled up a document on her screen, spun it around. Proposed Amendment 14.6. Restricting livestock on residential roadways. My stomach dropped. This was a brand new ordinance. It hadn't passed yet, but it had been submitted for review by none other than Carlton Reeves. That wasn't the worst part. The ordinance wasn't just for our neighborhood. If approved, it would affect the entire city. That man wasn't just coming after me. He was trying to change the law to fit his personal vendetta. That afternoon, I was riding shadow down the main road when I heard it. Sirens. I barely had time to turn before two police cruisers rolled up, red and blue lights flashing. The second the doors opened, I recognized one of the officers. Todd Reynolds. I'd known Todd since he was a rookie back when I worked as a mounted officer in the city police force. Afternoon, Todd, I said, keeping my voice even. Jameson, he sighed, rubbing his neck. We got calls. HOA complaints. Said you were riding an unauthorized animal on a residential street. I exhaled sharply. Todd, tell me something. Since when does the HOA control public roads? The officer beside him, some young guy, maybe new to the force, flipped open his notepad. Sir, the HOA has filed multiple reports about this. The president, Mr. Reeves, says... I don't care what Mr. Reeves says. I reached into my saddlebag, pulled out a thick folder of city zoning records. This road? Public, maintained by city taxes, not HOA jurisdiction. Todd took the papers, skimmed them, then looked back at his partner. He's right. The younger officer frowned. But the HOA doesn't make the law. That's when Carlton came marching out his house, arms crossed, acting like he was the governor of the state. Officer, are you arresting him? Todd gave him a look so flat it could have been a sidewalk. No, Carlton, we're not. Carlton's face turned red, then purple. Then you're useless, he spat. If you won't do your job, I'll handle this myself. And just like that, Carlton stormed back into his house. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. I had one call to make. I dialed 2 rings. Then I heard his voice. Dad. Jack, we have a problem. Silence. Then I heard his chair scrape against the floor. Tell me everything. I did. By the time I was finished, Jack wasn't just angry. He was furious. Dad, you need to let me handle this. You know I don't like using your position for favors. This isn't a favor, Jack said. This is the law. And I'm going to make damn sure Carlton realizes that. I let out a breath. What are you planning? Just sit tight. Carlton doesn't know who he's messing with. The next morning, my phone blew up with notifications. Carlton had gone full tyrant mode. He had held a press conference in front of City Hall with actual news reporters. The headline? Resident endangers community with wild horse. HOA president demands city action. I clicked the video. Carlton stood there, dressed like a cheap politician, shaking his head in mock disappointment. I'm afraid for the safety of our children, he said, voice dripping with fake concern. This reckless behavior must stop before someone gets hurt. Then he held up a blurry photo of Shadow trotting down the road. I nearly threw my coffee cup across the room. This was next-level manipulation. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a petition popped up online. Ban horses from residential neighborhoods. Over 500 signatures. Carlton wasn't just trying to ban my horse. He was trying to turn the entire town against me. But you know what? He made one mistake. He underestimated my son. Because Jack had already seen the press conference. And his response was going to change everything. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the streetlights flicker. My phone rang. It was Greg Turner. Greg and I had been friends for over 20 years. Our kids grew up together. We'd share beers on our porches, helped each other with home repairs. And he was on the HOA board. I answered, Greg, if your call had talked me down. Jameson, listen. His voice was low, cautious. You need to stop fighting this. I gritted my teeth. You know Carlton is making up these rules. Yeah, he admitted, but he's got the votes. Even if you win in court, the neighborhood will be against you. You'll never get a fair shake here again. I let out a slow breath. So what are you saying? Silence. Then Greg sighed. Maybe it's time to sell Jameson. Maybe it's time to walk away. A cold wave of betrayal swept through me. This was the same guy who helped me fix my fence last summer. The same guy who told me, this place wouldn't be the same without you. You already voted, didn't you? I asked quietly. Silence. That told me everything I needed to know. I guess I know where you stand now, Greg. And just like that, I lost a friend. The very next morning, a process server knocked on my door. Mr. Jameson? I opened the door. Yeah. He handed me a thick envelope. You've been served. I flipped through the papers. My stomach dropped. A lawsuit. The HOA was suing me for endangering public safety, damaging community roads, failing to comply with HOA regulations. They were demanding $25,000 in damages. This wasn't just about my horse anymore. This was an attempt to ruin me financially. Carlton wasn't just trying to get rid of me. He was trying to destroy me. I drove straight to City Hall. Jack was already waiting for me in his office. He looked at the lawsuit and immediately shook his head. Dad, this is bogus. They don't have legal grounds. Yeah, tell that to my bank account when I have to fight this in court. Jack tapped his fingers against his desk. His political mind was already working. What if I told you you might not have to? I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Jack slid a folder across the desk. Inside, a city investigation into Carlton Reeves. Dad, this guy isn't just corrupt, he's criminal. Jack had been digging, and what he found, Carlton had been embezzling HOA funds for years. He had personally profited from every single property foreclosure under the HOA. And the lawsuit against me? Filed using HOA money, which was illegal. Jack smirked. I think it's time we put Carlton in the spotlight. Jack filed an official request to review the HOA's financial records. A week later, half the documents were missing. I sat across from Jack in his office, staring at the empty folders he had just received from the HOA's lawyer. They erased them. I muttered. Jack leaned back in his chair, smirking. Yeah, that's illegal. So what now? Now. Jack pulled out his phone. Now I called the state auditors. And just like that, Carlton's little empire started to crumble. By the next week, the story had broken. Headlines everywhere. HOA president under investigation for fraud. City mayor opens inquiry into HOA corruption. Carlton had no idea what hit him. 1 minute, he was riding high, thinking he was untouchable. The next, reporters were showing up at his house, shoving microphones in his face. Mr. Reeves, is it true you've been misusing HOA funds? Do you have a response to the mayor's investigation? Carlton tried to spin it. This is all political. The mayor is only doing this to protect his father. But that's when the biggest bombshell dropped. One of Carlton's own allies flipped on him. Greg, the man who betrayed me. He went on record, confirming that Carlton had been illegally using HOA funds for years. Carlton's face was all over the news, and the lawsuit against me dropped. Just like that, I had won. The HOA had called for a final emergency meeting, likely to figure out how to spin this disaster. I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway. As I walked in, all eyes turned to me. Carlton sat at the head of the table, sweat beading on his forehead. His signature smirk long gone. Jameson, he said, forcing a grin, this is a private meeting. I dropped a thick manila folder on the table. Yeah? Well, consider this my RSVP. Everyone leaned forward as I pulled out official city documents, financial reports, and legal notices. This, I said, flipping open the first page. This is proof that you used HOA funds to pay your personal lawyer. I held up another page. This, a property deed for that house on Birchwood Lane, bought at a foreclosure sale by one of your shell companies. Gasps. Whispers spread across the room. Carlton stood up so fast his chair nearly flipped. This is ridiculous. This is a witch hunt. I leaned forward. No, Carlton, this is justice. Then the doors swung open. Jack walked in, flanked by 2 city attorneys. Carlton's face drained of color. Sit down, Carlton, Jack said. We need to talk. The city attorneys wasted no time. They laid out everything. How Carlton had been using HOA fines to buy foreclosed homes, flipping them for millions in profit. He had manipulated zoning laws to devalue properties, then bought them for pennies. And the worst part? He'd done it before. Another town. Another HOA. And guess what? He had been sued for fraud there, too. He settled quietly. Moved here. Started fresh. Now, the town knew. Neighbors who once supported him looked horrified. One woman stood up, shaking. You made me sell my home, she whispered. Told me it was worth less than it was. And then you bought it. Carlton's jaw clenched. He knew it was over. The HOA members who had once blindly followed him, they turned on him instantly. We trusted you, one shouted. You lied to all of us, another chimed in. Even Greg, the friend who betrayed me, stood up. I made a mistake, he said, and I won't stand by you anymore. Carlton tried to regain control. We can fix this. It's not what it looks like. But no one believed him. The room was erupting in chaos. And then Carlton made his final mistake. He pointed at me and snapped. This is your fault. If you had just followed the rules. Jack cut him off. What rules, Carlton? Silence. The ones you made up? Jack folded his arms. The ones you ignored when it benefited you? Carlton had no answer, and the next thing that happened, the police walked in. 2 officers stepped into the meeting. One of them nodded at Jack. "Mr. Reeves," the officer said, "we need to speak with you outside." Carlton laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. You think you can arrest me? This is a misunderstanding." The officer held up a warrant. "We have 5 counts of fraud, 3 of embezzlement, and 2 of unlawful property acquisition." The room fell dead silent. Then Carlton's anger snapped. He slammed his hands on the table, yelling, "You think you're taking me down? This isn't over." The officers calmly stepped forward. "It is Carlton." Click. Handcuffs. And just like that, the king of the HOA was dethroned. You'd think after all that the HOA would back down. Nope. Carlton's remaining allies tried one last move. They held a late-night emergency vote to keep the horse ban in place. Their reasoning? Well, even if Carlton was corrupt, it doesn't change the fact that horses don't belong in the neighborhood. But there was one problem. Jack had already sent a motion to the city council, and the next morning, an official announcement was made. All illegally passed HOA rules were nullified, including the horse ban. That morning, as I saddled up Shadow for our ride, I saw something beautiful. The same neighbors who once glared at me, now they waved. One of them called out, "Nice to see you riding again, Jameson." I smiled. Shadow trotted forward. And just like that, balance was restored. The day after Carlton's arrest, Jack called me. "Dad, I need you to come down to City Hall." His voice was serious. "There's something you need to see." So I drove over, walked into his office. And there, laid out on his desk, a set of documents that changed everything. Jack tapped one of them. "This is the original city survey of Willow Ridge, back when it was first developed." I skimmed through the papers, and that's when I saw it. Every single road in our neighborhood classified as public property, meaning the HOA had never had legal authority over them. Not ever. Carlton had spent years convincing everyone otherwise, enforcing rules that were never his to make. And the worst part? The previous HOA boards knew. They just went along with it. Jack exhaled. "Dad, this means every HOA fine they've ever issued regarding road usage is invalid." I sat back. "You're telling me that for years, people paid thousands of dollars in fines for nothing?" Jack nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." And that's when I knew this wasn't just about my horse anymore. This was about every homeowner who had been bullied, manipulated, and scammed. It was time to make things right. The moment the truth came out, people were furious. Homeowners demanded refunds for bogus fines. Old HOA board members resigned overnight. Jack filed an official city complaint against the HOA for overstepping their authority. And within a week, a special community meeting was held. This time, it wasn't an HOA power play. It was a reckoning. Neighbors packed into the meeting hall. People stood up, one after another, sharing stories of how they had been harassed, overcharged, or forced into compliance with illegal rules. The final nail in the coffin, Jack stood before the crowd, holding up a signed city order. By the power of the mayor's office, all invalid HOA fines are to be refunded immediately, and all HOA enforced restrictions on public property are now considered void. The room erupted into cheers. And just like that, the HOA lost its grip on the town. The few remaining board members, they had no choice but to step down. And for the first time in years, Willow Ridge was finally free. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I was out back, brushing Shadow down. When I heard a car pull up, I turned, and standing there, awkwardly clutching a purse, was Margaret Reeves, Carlton's wife. The same woman who had glared at me from across the street for years. The same woman who had stood by Carlton's side while he destroyed lives. I crossed my arms. "Didn't expect to see you here, Margaret." She hesitated. Then she took a deep breath. "Jameson, I came to apologize." I stared at her. Apologize? I knew what Carlton was doing wasn't right, she admitted. But I never spoke up. I was afraid of what it would mean for me, for my reputation. I didn't say anything, because honestly, I wasn't sure how to feel. But then, she pulled something out of her purse. A checkbook. She flipped it open. I want to return the HOA money I benefited from, she said, and I want to help make things right. I raised an eyebrow. Why the sudden change of heart? She looked past me at Shadow, because I see it now. This isn't just about a horse. This was never about a horse. She swallowed. It was about power. And I stood by and let it happen. I studied her face. For the first time, she actually looked genuine. I sighed. Margaret, you can't undo what happened. But if you really want to make things right, I nodded toward the community center. Help us rebuild what Carlton broke. She met my eyes. Then she nodded. I will. With the HOA's grip gone, the town started changing. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now spoke up. People started reconnecting, helping each other instead of reporting each other. Jack worked with the city to form a fair neighborhood committee, one that actually helped instead of controlled. And the best part? The town finally embraced its history. They restored old horse trails, opened a community stable, and instead of banning horseback riding, they actually hosted a parade for it. And me? Well, I finally got to ride Shadow through town without a single person trying to stop me. Instead, they waved, they smiled, they cheered, and I realized something. For the first time in a long time, this place actually felt like home again. A few weeks later, I was out in my yard when I saw a little girl staring at Shadow through the fence. She looked about 7 years old. Big brown eyes, hands gripping the fence like she was afraid to ask something. I walked over. You like horses? I asked. She nodded, shy but excited. That's when I noticed something. A woman standing behind her. Margaret Reeves, her granddaughter. Margaret gave me a small, hesitant smile. She's been watching your horse all week, she said. I told her maybe if we asked nicely. I looked back at the little girl. Then I smiled. Tell you what, I said. How about a riding lesson? The girl's face lit up like Christmas morning. Margaret's expression softened. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes the best revenge isn't winning. It's helping your enemy see the world through new eyes.